If you were asked to tell your story in a professional sense or at home even, could you do it? Often we hear that people just don't have a story to tell. Um, I don't know if that's true. I think everyone's probably got at least one story in them. So much so I wanted to discuss it on our podcast today. Um, I'm delighted that joining us is leadership expert, storytelling expert, published author, TED speaker on the topic of story, Karen Eber. She joins us all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, in the States. We're going to discuss a lot around the power of story, more so in a professional setting, structures of it, pitfalls, why we avoid them, but ultimately what results we can expect from them. Karen, I'm delighted that you can join us today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to do so and discuss the topic of storytelling. Please do take some time to introduce yourself. What's your story? Who do you help? And why are you here?
Rob, I'm so happy to be with you today. I work with individuals on how they are communicating in a more memorable way. So often that is people in Fortune 500 companies in how they're building their leaders and shaping their teams and creating a culture that people want to work in. And storytelling is such a big piece of that. I come from a 20-year career on the other side of the desk in companies like General Electric and Deloitte, where I was a head of culture and a chief learning officer and head of leadership development. So I was always in this place where I was trying to get approval for investments, and one person could say yes and 99 people could say no. And I learned that storytelling cut through all of that. And then I did this little TED talk that took off, and it's led to this book, The Perfect Story, and my ability to have my own company and help people on their journey to being memorable leaders.
Wow, fantastic, fantastic. And congratulations on the TED Talk and the work that you do. It's really
Thank you.
good stuff, really brilliant. And I'm glad that you're here with us today. Obviously, your experience has spanned what, a couple of decades, 3 decades. I guess stories have always existed, but do you feel that stories in the workplace are more relevant now than before? If yes, why? And if not, why not?
I don't think they're more relevant. I think they're getting more attention now. And some of that is before the human was doing everything. We were the person that was putting the papers in the filing cabinet and creating all of the things. And now technology makes that so much easier, freeing up the ability for us to communicate and to relate. And we recognize that the more technology, the faster pace, the more things change, you need to have a way to connect with people. And stories are a really helpful way to do that. So it's not that they're more relevant, they've always been relevant. It's just we're recognizing, based on new understanding of the brain in the past 15, 20 years, and the amount of noise we are all filtering through, that it can help in both places.
It's interesting your focus on leaders and leadership specifically. What I found fascinating about I think it was your TED talk I saw this in was the headline of leaders are allergic to telling stories, and that made me really sit up and listen because we see that quite a lot with and I guess in the more traditional B2B manufacturing lubricant conversations and boardrooms that we sit, it's very stat based, very data based. Very rarely
Very
do we hear stories from
boring.
leaders. Very, you said that, not me, Karen.
Yeah, this is part of where leaders are allergic to storytelling. I joke that I'm on a one-person mission to rid the world of boring meetings, one story at a time. And it's so well intended, right? We are in way too many meetings and don't have enough time to prepare. So instead of really thinking about what is it that I want people to come away from this meeting doing differently, or what decision has to be made, we pick an existing PowerPoint deck that we have and we talk at people, because we don't have time to really stop and think through what are we trying to do and then what's the best way to get there. And as a result, you don't remember what was said 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes after the meeting. Much of it is lost. And it's a waste of time and attention and energy, because none of us come out of meetings saying, I feel so much smarter. That was an amazing use of time. And if we could change that just a little bit, where leaders are getting the chance to think through what they want to say and they're getting the chance to prepare, you are going to get so much further. You're going to be able to have fewer meetings. People will resonate and have different discussions that are needed. And because of the lack of time, because of the vulnerability involved, and because of not ever being taught how to do this, leaders avoid it because it just feels so uncomfortable. And it feels so much easier to just put up my chart and talk about it, even though I've bored everyone in the meeting. No one has the information that we need, and we don't even have enough agreement to have a discussion on it. But I feel like I've done my job, and everyone else just zones out and makes their mental checklists and prepares what groceries they're going to buy in their head until it's time to come back and nod their head and say, good job.
It's strange, isn't it? I'm sure you've been to many of the similar expos and conferences where the talks are basically just a red line on a chart and a blue line on a chart. And the crowd, you can almost see them thinking about their train home, their flight home, their hotel, because there is no connection. And I wonder, why is that? Is it because leaders or speakers or those presenting have got so busy, the people below them have such short time spans, so they think they have to get information over quickly? Where does it go wrong, do you think?
Yeah, I think two things, and I'm probably going to forget one of them. So I'm going to tell you the two so you can remind me. One is about data, which I'll start with. The second is about our brains. So when I forget that, please help me remember. We do still have this bias that data is factual, it's credible, it is the basis for how we make decisions. And I am not here to say data are not important, but I think that we misuse it. We misuse it in how we collect it and how we communicate it and how we tee it up. More data is more data isn't better. The person closest to the data has the responsibility of making it meaningful for everyone else. And if I put up an image of an ink blot and we were able to call on different listeners, you would hear, if we called on 10 people, you would hear 10 different responses for what they see in the ink blot. And that's because our brain is looking at things, is listening to things and experiencing things and constantly making assumptions for what they are, because our brain wants to make assumptions and respond versus react. Reacting is very inefficient on the body. It's a drain of calories, and it pulls on the calories needed for other things. So we're constantly guessing what things are, which is why you try to guess what an ink blot is, or you start a movie and you're trying to guess where it's going, or same with a book or even someone in a meeting. And the problem with that with data is people will put up a slide that is a beautiful chart, well matched colors. It is literally, well composed. Any artists out there would give them a high five, but they'll put it up and they'll say the data speaks for itself. But the problem is the 10 of us that just said different things about the ink blot are coming to different assumptions about that data, even the most simple piece of data, because we make these predictions about our understanding based on our experiences, and your experiences are different than mine. It means we're making different assumptions. So the first problem when you just put up data and you aren't taking people through it is we're not even in the same conversation about what the data means. And so you add to this bias of data are fact and more data is important. And now you just have created a lot of noise. And this is why we have what's the source of this data? Do we really believe the credibility of it? Is it clean data? And now we're debating all of this stuff about the data instead of having the conversation about what it's meant to inform. And underneath all of this is the second one, which I did remember, quite proud of myself. Our brains are lazy. So we are not meant to be fully immersed all day, every day, and listening and comprehending and taking things in. Our brain is meant to pay attention and have these moments of immersion and dip out. And that's because the brain is a broker of calories for the body, and it is the stingiest broker. It is constantly trying to decide, is this worth the calorie spend? So I like to think of it in two buckets. There's a bucket of non-negotiable calories that are going to go for respiration and circulatory systems and all the things you need to stay alive. Never want to run out of those calories, pretty important. But there's the second bucket that are the discretionary ones for attention, for focus, for engagement, for immersion, for effort. And that's going to vary. That's going to vary based on how well slept we are, if we're hungry, the environment around us. But it's also going to vary based on how interesting the information is being presented. I cannot play chess. I wish I could. I can't. Anytime someone sits down to teach me, I get, 1 minute in and then I get frustrated and I give up because for whatever reason, I've decided that that's too hard and I don't want to learn it. And my brain is just like, we don't feel like taking the time to learn this. So just stop, right? That is my brain being lazy because perhaps no one has taught it to me in a way that is really interesting. It just feels like a lot of maths that are unnecessary.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens in meetings. If someone is just talking at you and putting up the blue line and the red line, and it's beautifully composed, but you're not doing anything to make me have some type of interaction with it, my brain might say, this is a really good moment to save some calories. Like, we're still paying attention, but we're not necessarily connecting with it and having any meaning, which is needed to inform decision making.
Yeah, so you're almost there, but not there, which is where the thoughts of the lunchtime come in or the train ride home come in, because it's just numbers. Yeah, I really like what you say about it's creating 10 different interpretations of the same number. So therefore we're constantly guessing. So therefore leaders are actually creating more confusion in their meetings than actual impact. And
Right.
something else that you mentioned there as you were sharing that is you mentioned two words which I assume become quite awkward in some or most leadership teams, certainly in the introduction of. One is vulnerability and one is empathy. I think for some, those words are quite difficult to get a hold of in the workplace because I think they'll think that's for home, that's for the family, stories are for bedtime. Vulnerability and empathy can be quite challenging, as I'm sure you've seen as well. Could you give us a little understanding about why they're important in building a case for storytelling and how it connects to a thing called oxytocin?
Yeah, there's a couple pieces to this. So when I start sharing a story and you connect with it, you feel compelled, like this is interesting. You do start feeling empathy towards me. You start to feel this connection and appreciation and almost this compassion for me telling a story. Now, this doesn't have to be a personal story. It doesn't have to be a revealing story, but you are responding to me being vulnerable in that moment by communicating in a different way and sharing something that is at the heart of connection. And as you develop empathy, your brain starts to release oxytocin. And the more of this that you feel in response to my story, the more oxytocin released, which is almost sending a signal to your brain that is, I trust her. Like, I feel comfortable being around her. She feels safe to be around, meaning we can have a discussion and disagree. We can have the basis of all the things we talk about with psychological safety. And that leads to an increase in trust. So there's been several different studies where they've been able to actually measure oxytocin levels before and after a story, when a story is used or not used. And there is this spike when it is an authentic story that you are responding to. And so, for leaders, this can be such an important thing because your employees will respond to you telling a story. Not a made-up story, not a fabricated story, not propaganda, but when they really feel like you're sharing a story, there is that response, which then brings the question of, but I don't want to tell a personal story. I don't, that's not who I want to be at work. And that's completely fine. Personal doesn't mean private. Every story that you tell is personal, meaning there's a reason why you were the one telling it. You are bringing a perspective forward for the audience to connect with, even if it's someone else's story. You have to make it personal, but it doesn't mean that you're sharing something private that you don't want to share with others. So the opening of my TED Talk, I tell a story about two people that are not me. This woman, Maria, that drops her phone down an elevator shaft, and Walt Benninger, who is the CEO of Charles Schwab. And this is two stories about events that happened to them that I bring together, but I make the story personal because you get my perspective. You get why I am telling it. And so that is what people respond to. and this has happened, I've gotten messages from all over the world where people experience empathy watching this video on a computer screen and feel like they know me because they watched this 13-minute talk. So it can, when done well, it can be this thing that creates the environment, not just for your employees to trust you, but also for teams to have some comfort. So this is why there's a offsite retreat. Everyone is getting the chance to talk over tea, over dinner, and you come away feeling a little bit closer. That is because you underwent this oxytocin shift, that as people shared little moments about their work, their experiences, that started to flow.
Fascinating stuff. And just before we move on to sort of the structure of a story and where people can get started with it, I wondered if you had any specific case studies, either organizations you work with, that you've read, some that you've shared, where telling a story transformed the outcomes of a business, where they may have been hesitant before they started and they saw tremendous outcomes. What sort of results can we see? Have you got any case studies around that?
There's so many, but I prefer to go to smaller moments because it's really easy for people listening to say, oh, but that was that company. I want you to connect to a small moment. So one of my clients who works for a Fortune 500 company got a message that said, you are going to have a 5-minute presentation with the CEO in a week. You need to talk about this app that they were developing, lessons learned, and your recommendations. And the implication was do this well. And when it's time for promotion, you're going to be remembered. Do this badly, and you were stuck in the back of the line, never to move forward again. He's a head of data analytics. His instinct is, let me put up a chart. Let me talk to you about all the data we have on this app and all the things that we need to do and my recommendations. And he did vomit all of that out onto a page to get it out of him. But then he stepped back and we worked on a story. And this was around the holiday time. And the story was about this app that you can use to turn things on and off in your home. And he told this story about decorating his home for the holidays with his family and going up and down the stairs 17 times to get boxes in the right rooms. And how when he opened the first box, he saw the ornament from his daughter's first Christmas many Christmases ago, and how nostalgic that felt. And then his family decorated the home, and later that night, he was in bed and realized he forgot to turn the lights off. And so he starts with this story. And then he goes into what they learned and his recommendations. And he had one piece of data, no slides in the entire thing. That day, 5 people presented. And that day, the CEO walked up to one person. It was my client. And the CEO said, he connected with the story about the holiday and started sharing his own story about his child's first Christmas and that feeling of nostalgia that he had. And so by going against what felt right was, let's put up the chart, let's rely on the data, but instead, in 5 minutes, taking at least 30 seconds of that to use a story made all the difference, because it made that connection. It set a completely different tone for the rest of the presentations. Unfortunately, everyone else got up and was like, well, mine isn't as good as that, because he had set the tone. And so I like using examples like that because those are reachable for anybody. It's the choice in one moment to choose to communicate in a way that may be different than the rest of the organization, to challenge yourself to say, can I put something in here in 30 minutes that will touch to the outcome that I want for the audience? And that, consistently you start to see those shifts. And we know it because we have been the recipient of these stories and come away feeling something from them.
Well, and the example you shared there with was it a guy, or a girl?
Yeah, it was a guy. Yeah.
The guy who was telling a story about, I assume it was Christmas time, where
Yeah.
it kind of tells you that everyone has a story somewhere.
Yeah.
We must hear it so often. You must hear it daily. I don't have a story to tell. I'm just boring. Do you think genuinely everyone has a story to tell?
Yeah, hundreds. The challenge is that when we get backed up against a moment when we want to tell a story or need to tell a story, it is that much harder to tell one, because when we are under stress, you have a little bit of cortisol flowing in the body and you don't think as freely as when you are relaxed. And so the best time to come up with potential ideas for a story is before you ever need to tell one, where you are capturing moments from your life, from articles you read, from documentaries you watch, from professional experiences, from things that you hear your customers and clients and employees say, and you build this list, because when it's time to tell a story, then you go down and see which one of these will let me build an idea on this or that. The reason that we feel like we don't have stories to tell is that our brain is a collection of files. So picture it like a file system on your computer. And if you go to maybe the computer view or the desktop view, like, you don't know what file to go into. There's so many. You just kind of say, I don't know what I have. But if we focused and really dug into a specific idea, you would realize there are endless stories there to capture and to be able to build on. And so everyone has many stories, whether they are your experiences, whether they are other people's experiences. These are things that intrigue you, that fascinate you, that you struggle with. These become the building blocks for a story.
I guess listening to that, like personally, I'm kind of reflecting back on that and thinking, I'm sure I've got countless things that have happened to me, but either there's almost like an ego thing of I don't what no one wants to hear that.
Yeah, everybody goes through that, but we do, because this is why when you're at that retreat and someone is sharing something about their family vacation, family holiday, or something about their journey as a professional, you're fascinated by it. We never think the things that we are involved in are interesting and fascinating. And this is where a toolkit comes in, is it gives you something to look at and react to, instead of sitting in this place where you are already feeling like, I am the most boring person alive. Why would anybody want to hear this? You can take the smallest things and make them the most fascinating and interesting. It's just working the process and not expecting that you are going to uncover the most perfect story sitting on a shelf and an end cap, like you pick it up and it's ready to go. There is no such thing as the perfect story. It becomes perfect by taking your ideas and working it through a process to engage the audience's brain and know that you're putting things in that they will respond to.
Yeah, is it? I'm just thinking as you're speaking, part of our training that we do, we have a training methodology that spans a period of time, so it's quite intense. But to help break that down, we introduce story. So we brought in a central character. So it's not training anymore. It's a
Yeah.
story with interventions where people can apply and they can see where this guy goes wrong or this guy goes right. And he has a problem, then he does this and he resolves the problem. So he's much better now. And so I can see where it fits from like third party storytelling. But yeah, it's a big blocker of mine, definitely.
Well, here's why that works, whether it is you telling a story or whether it's a third party story. If I was saying to you, imagine you are getting your boxes to decorate your home and you are putting them where they need to be and you are opening them. That doesn't work. It's too much. Like, our brain almost says, why are you telling me what to do? And I'm trying to picture what you're saying, but if my image isn't matching what you're saying, then my brain is like, this is like chess, let's give up. Like, we're not going to do this. The difference though is, as you start telling a story, whether it is about you or someone else, the audience member experiences the story, but they have the highlight of their own experiences and their own story running in their head, which could be things that they've experienced, or it could be them wondering, what would I have done? So the more detailed you are in what you do, the easier it is for them to picture their own version along with it. And this is why people will respond to your story with a story. So when you feel like, oh, I don't have a story to tell, the act of you telling a story will prompt the audience to think of theirs. The key is that you want to be telling it in service of an outcome. So you don't just want to be telling the story you love, which, in my home is like the uncle at the holiday table that is always telling the same story over and over, and none of us need to be there. Like, that's not in service of anything. But if someone is really thinking about, what do I want this group to come away with, and they are telling a detailed story, it gives the audience permission to picture their own version of that and follow along, which is what you want.
Yeah, you just mentioned a good word there. It gives them permission. And I think that comes back. I've connected with empathy. Therefore, the storyteller gives permission, and it creates a much more, I guess, of a bond between the listener and the teller, I assume. So let's get into it, Karen, around the key elements of a story. Because if someone's sitting here thinking, yeah, that's it, I'm going to change my leadership. Personally, I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, I have got a story to tell. I need to get over my own ego and think that some people do need to hear it. I'm going to write. I've got my pen, but where do we start? What's a structure we can look at to start telling our story?
Actually, I want to start in a different spot, which is with the audience. So even if you know the idea you want to share, your story always starts with your audience, because there's some reason why you're telling it. There's some outcome that you want, whether that is some internal feeling you want them to have, or some action you want them to take. Even when we are with friends, we tell stories to entertain, right? There's something that we want from it. And so this is why you want to start hearing stories. So you want to ask yourself 4 questions. What do you want your audience to feel internally? What is that shift you want them to experience? What do you want them to know or do as a result of the story? What is their mindset today, and what might be an obstacle in getting them to do what you want them to know, think, feel, or do? So if you start there, even in 5 minutes before a meeting, even if you're not telling a story and you are communicating, but you just stop and really ground yourself with a sentence for each of these, it is helping you focus on what it is you're trying to do, whether that's communicating data or communicating in general or sharing a story. You need to start here, because if you don't, you may end up like that uncle at the holiday table that is just talking at people and not necessarily connecting with them. But by thinking about the outcome that you want, their mindset and potential obstacles, you can now build your story with that in mind and put things in that will help move them to where you want them to go. So that's always step 1. Even when you know the idea or the story you want to share, you want to ground yourself in that.
Interesting. Yeah, I like the feel, the shift, the know or do, and the obstacle. Because it puts you in their position, so you're in their service almost, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just it helps remove the ego potentially as well, because you're helping them overcome something. And once we've understood that, Karen, does every story in a professional sense follow the same as what the movies follow? I.e., there's that hero, there's a challenge, there's something that happened. Is it the guide, the guide story? I think it is, isn't it? Is it the similar flow that you use? I've just described it terribly, so please help me out.
It doesn't. So that's the hero's journey from
That's the
Joseph
one.
Campbell. Yeah, there's also popularized in Star Wars movies. There's Pixar has a wonderful storytelling model. I find that none of them are helpful to the person that's looking to land an idea in a meeting, because they are formulaic. There are specific steps that are great for fiction, but it is one type of story. And most often, a leader will try to take their idea and back it into it. And the hero's journey is really quite complicated. I don't even know how many steps, 12, 13. And if you can't fit your idea in it, then they give up, just like I do with chess. And then they don't tell a story. So what I prefer is for people to do a skeleton. This doesn't have to be the order that you tell your story in, but it helps you organize the pieces. So the first one, you're going to write one sentence for what is the setting? What's the context of the story? So what's the setting of it? Who's involved? Like, why should the audience care? You would write 1 or 2 sentences for that. And then you would go to the conflict, and this is going to be the heart of the story. This is the tension. It's what's at stake. It's the thing that needs to be explored, which it could be between 2 people in a business environment. It could be between 2 businesses or between 2 parts of the organization. It is often between a person and themselves struggling with their own values, something that they want different. You write a sentence for what is that conflict? Because this is the fuel of your story. A third sentence for the outcome. What action is taken because of the conflict? What happens? And then the last sentence is going to be for the takeaway, which is what is that idea that you want the audience coming away from the story with? And if you do this right, the takeaway maps back to what you said you wanted the audience to know, think, feel, or do. You should be able to see how they fit. If they don't fit, then you go back and rework it to make sure that you have indeed built a story that's going to achieve what you want for the audience.
It's very clear. It's much more simple than the 13-step hero's journey, right? Which obviously has its place. But yeah, if you're thinking of a keynote or something and you're trying to have 13 steps, you're probably going to tie yourself in knots.
Well, more importantly, what I don't like about the hero's journey for the average person is that it is one type of story that always involves a hero, but we are messy creatures with mistakes and foibles and things that don't fit well into that. And they shouldn't be rejected because there isn't a hero or there isn't something. So what I want and what you're able to do with these 4 pieces is you can tell any type of story that you want, and then you can start to play with the order and experiment with different things to make it be really engaging for the brain. With the hero's journey or even the Pixar films, you are getting the same type of story over and over. And if your story doesn't fit into that, or your idea doesn't fit into that, you struggle. I had a leader at the beginning of COVID. His company had been in the office, a face-to-face culture. And then, like so many, they started to work from home and very quickly were making these changes. And he had always been taught, here, there are 4 stories you need to be able to tell, the where you're going story and the why we can't stay here and all of these very formulaic things. And by the 3rd week of COVID, he was out of stories. And what he really needed was, how do I tell stories about trust or hope? I mean, people were now concerned about families and keeping them safe and what would happen to the company and how does he keep motivation going? And so the challenge with people saying, here are the 4 stories you need to tell, or here's this formula, is that life is not that neat. And I would hate for people to abandon something because they aren't given the tools to make it work for the situation they're in.
And on that, Karen, it's a good example of perhaps where, yeah, we do fall back on structure too much, and it soon becomes we're watching repeats and reruns of the same stories. What pitfalls and mistakes do you see people making where you just think, oh God, they've got that wrong, or oh, I wish they hadn't have done that? What are some of the horror stories that you've experienced that might warn against watchers and listeners of this podcast?
It wouldn't even be horror stories, but it is things that will make the audience's brain disengage. And the first is just you're telling the story you want to tell and not the one that the audience needs to hear. Like, we all have our favorite stories, but that doesn't mean every occasion is a reason to tell it. And if there's not something you want the audience to come away with and you can't connect it to that, then you are no better than the uncle at the holiday table telling that story again. That's a big one. Another one, I don't think people realize when they do this, they list events and they don't have any story. We did this and this and this and then this and then this and then this. Like, that's not a story. That's like you're sitting through a slideshow of someone's holiday.
Or my
The
5-year-old
story,
from school.
yeah. But your 5-year-old, I'm sure, also then describes something that they're super excited about in the day. And that's what we need, of not just a listing of events. And this often happens with storytelling with data. It's like, we did this and this and this and this, but why did you do it? What are you trying to learn? What were the characters feeling? Why did they do what they do? Like, even going one click down into why it makes a difference. And so on the first draft, for sure, get out the this, then this, then this, get it down, but then really turn it into more of a story form. The brain will engage so much more in a much more engaged, interesting way than when it's just being listed. And the third one we touched on is where people will not put a structure on their story. So we just gave a structure, but what it sounds like when there isn't a structure is often something like this. I went to go meet my friend yesterday for lunch, and was it yesterday or last week? It may have been last week because I was running late and it was raining, and it was last week for sure. It wasn't yesterday. It was last week. So I'm running late and it's raining and I forgot my umbrella. And maybe it was yesterday. Like, people do this all the time. And as the listener, you just want to shake them and say, get to the point. None of this matters. What's happening is really genuine. The person's trying to place themselves back in that moment because they want to connect to it and tell it as authentically as they remember. Much of those details aren't important, though. And you end up losing the audience because it's just taking so long to get there because there's no structure. So something like that story skeleton helps you, even 5 minutes before you tell a story, put the major pieces together and be able to tell something that's easier for you to share and so much easier for the audience to hear.
Your example there sounds like you've been sat with my mom for a while. She, yeah, just
Is
get to
she
the
guilty of
point. Just
that?
get to the point. Yeah,
Yeah.
she forgets what day it is too. I was going to ask Karen. You referenced just 5 minutes before your meeting. Is this something that you think you can, as you're going into an important meeting that you're preparing for, whatever meeting that is? Can you nail this down in 5 minutes? Just say, right, using the context, the conflict, the outcome, the takeaway. These are the points I want to get across. Is it something that can happen that quick? Or is it something that's more considered, or is it both?
Yeah, it's both. I like to think of it as a continuum. So if I'm with you and in the moment I decide to tell a story, yeah, we can just try it. I will feel inspired and I will just in real time try to describe the context, conflict, outcome, takeaway, and tell it in that order. And it's okay if I haven't told that. So in coaching conversations, in one-on-ones, that doesn't have to be rehearsed. The higher the stakes, the more you do want to practice it, only because your story will improve through iterations. The things we're talking about is not even the 101 level, right? It's the foundations. There's more that you would want to be able to add to the story and play with how you're telling it and use your voice and pacing. And like, there's so many different things to experiment with. The real story emerges when you have time to edit it and work with it. And so if you're going to be on a stage, if you're going to be doing a really big presentation, you don't want to leave it for 5 minutes beforehand. You do want to practice it because it will benefit from the iteration. However, I don't want people not telling stories because they feel inspired in the moment and they think, well, I haven't had a chance to try this. Like, if you feel something in the moment, try it. But as you know, you have these bigger stakes things, leave yourself more time because um, you will not get a story perfect in the first draft. I don't. You will get pieces down, but then you have to think about, one, have I achieved what I want for the audience? Two, how do I make sure the brain is really engaged? Are there places for me to add certain things or take away? And so that just takes, you need a little bit of space between when you create and when you get to edit and refine it.
Yeah, so I guess the advice there is to take a step back and consider the context that you're speaking to, right? Big
Yeah,
keynote, I'm going to prepare more.
sure.
Small team meeting, it might be a good place to practice. But
Great.
get going, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do we measure success, Karen? How do we know that we've nailed it? Is there a return on investment for storytelling that you've seen?
What happens when I'm working with people that are hesitant to tell stories is we find a way for them to tell a story so they can see the reaction and they go through the nerves and they go through the discomfort of standing in front of a group or being on front of a screen and sharing a story. And then they see the response that they get, which is always amazing. People will always respond to it. And that then gives them momentum to try it again and do more. It's a little bit like if you've ever gone to a pool and you stood on the diving board and you look down and you think, no way, who is jumping off this? But you jump off the little one, you're like, okay. And then maybe you work your way up. That just it's key. There's no way around it. You can't think your way out of it, but you will always feel some type of response where people will respond to different things in your story because we're all different creatures, but it will have a wonderful impact.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm kind of getting it's about understanding where it fits in your business, because I think one of the most impactful things that I did when I started working for myself 10 years ago, I just did what my mom did. Was it 10 years ago or was it 9 years ago? 10
Yeah.
years ago,
Yeah.
was do public speaking training, because I knew that I had I had to step out of my comfort zone to put myself in a position where the outcome of a positive result was much better than the hesitancy of me doing nothing. Because I wanted to create spaces like this. I want to talk to people like yourself. I
Yeah.
want to get on stage and do keynotes. I knew that I was my own blocker in that case. So the best thing I did was the public speaking training. I think to bolt onto that is actually the understanding of story, knowing how to create through understanding your audience, the context, the conflict, the outcome, the takeaway. Being able to speak is one thing, being able to structure a message is a completely other, but yet highly rewarding facet to leadership. It has to be.
Yeah, it's core in business. So if you're an entrepreneur, you're a part of a small business, this is how you are going to attract potential clients. They're going to see themselves in the stories that you're sharing and the problems that you're solving. They're going to aspire to have what you're describing, or they're going to recognize that they need to do something else. But the same is true as you're attracting employees in any company. It's those stories that are already happening. People tell them every day. They tell them when they're gathered with friends. And so the ability to use stories to help employees, to coach, to attract with different people, to motivate, it's a core skill. What you're doing in it varies each time, and it's going to vary by audience, but it's a skill that if you don't have, it's very hard to cut through the noise in today's world.
I think that's a great summary. It's difficult to cut through a noisy world if you just sound like everyone else, right? There is no
Yeah.
story. I'm just me. So, Karen, I'd like, if possible, I always like to round off our conversations with this because it's what all the buzzy podcasts do. Quick wins. How can someone listening to this start practicing, take something away and do today differently, having listened to the past 40 minutes or so of us talking about story? Where can someone start?
The easiest place is look for opportunities to tell stories. And that sounds silly. That sounds frivolous. But people do not come to your door and knock on it and say, Rob, will you tell us a story? You are going to sneak the stories into meetings, into conversations with employees, into client conversations, into presentations. You're going to tell stories when people say focus on the data. You're going to tell stories when you have 5-minute meetings. What happens is it's a compounding skill. The more you do it, the more you get asked for it, and the more you get identified and differentiated as a compelling communicator. You can learn to apply all the steps. You can learn to go through all the things we've talked about, but you have to recognize that people don't come to you and ask for you to tell a story. You find those opportunities, and that's the best thing to do. Of find one small place in a conversation, in a meeting, that you can try telling a story in the next week, and just keep building it. Challenge yourself each week to find at least one place to do it.
Brilliant. Karen, thank you so much. Where can we see more about your work? The Perfect Storybook, the TED Talks. Where can we connect with you and find out your work moving forward?
Yeah, best place is my website, which is my name, KarenEber.com. On there is a page dedicated to the book, The Perfect Story. I feel like I also want to mention, because people always say this to me,
Please.
one of the features of The Perfect Story is that there are checklists in the back of the book, which summarize all the different things that we talk about to make it easy to leverage the tools. So you can find about The Perfect Story, the TED Talks on there, and I have a blog called Brain Food that offers free suggestions on storytelling and leadership.
Fantastic. Karen, thank you so much again for taking time with us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you and unpacking about stories. I found it really fascinating on a personal
Thank you.
level as well. So thank you very much for that. Have a great day.
Thank you.